Hello, everybody. My name is Elle, and thank you so much for tuning into my podcast called A Quiet Voice, where I talk about the thoughts and opinions that went through my mind as an introverted Gen Z. Today, on this episode, I would like to talk about the commonly held belief that introverts are shy people. This I find extremely frustrating because a lot of us are not shy. We just are what other people will call those a few words. Their quiet strength is much more useful than the overly loud sort of bulldozing that some people find themselves doing. And despite being quiet, we can make a big impact into a room. So, if you could just get a warm drink, find a comfortable place to sit, and relax as I take you on to another journey into my mind. Okay, so this episode is about the notion that introverts are shy. I'm sure many of us have heard this before from family or friends telling us that we really need to grow up and grow out of ourselves because it's going to hold us back. And we needed to be more outgoing and feel happy speaking to other people. This notion that introverts are always shy, well, I don't know about you, but it always got onto my nerves, especially as I have grown older. Because there was a time of which I was an actual shy person. Back when I was younger and I was still working onto my speech, it was at a level of which made me shy or nervous to speak because I, at that time, was still frequently being misunderstood because my speech was not comprehensible. I'm sure given that circumstance, even some extroverts would be nervous when speaking if they were frequently misunderstood and meant to feel bad about it. But the years passed, and my speech changed, and then changed again and changed again. But as I grew older, I did eventually reach a level of speech of which people no longer could identify me as having a speech disorder. Now it's turned into more of an accent that has people asking me, "Where are you from?" Of which I would say I'm Canadian. And then they would say, "Well, where are your parents from?" And then I say, "Jamaica." And then the look of confusion onto their face gets worse. They would try and make up some sort of excuse for why asking because they just wanted to know where my accent's from. They want to know if we've lived anyplace else. And I'm like, no, born and raised in Canada. I had a lisp when I was younger, and now I speak like this, as my explanation why I don't sound Canadian. Oftentimes I would get told that I sound like I'm a British person or somewhere else into the UK. And then I had to smile and nod and be like, yeah, I get that a lot. Which I did, especially working in retail. That is the area of which people feel the most comfortable just asking you at the end of your interaction, just where are you from? Because you sound different from the rest of us, and I just really want to know. I want to know if I can guess correctly. So, yes, there was a time of which I was shy, and my family remembers that time quite fondly to the point of which they still attribute that as being the reason why I'm quiet now. My mother's and I still constantly get into arguments of which she would tell me that the reason why I struggled so much trying to enter the workforce is because of how I spoke. She now acknowledges that my speech is clear enough that it's not because my speech is incomprehensible. It's because of how I spoke. My voice was too light. Or I was just simply not speaking enough. When applying for a position in management, nobody would take you seriously if you spoke like that. You need to get the firmness into your voice, or else how would any respective employer take you seriously? how would your subordinates take you seriously? At which time I then proceed to argue because I know that my speech is not how it used to be. And I also know that how I speak to my family is not the same way how I speak to others. When I'm at home, I don't feel the need to speak in complete sentences or try and put too much accent onto my voice. I speak however way it just happens to come out at the time, and that adjusts for who I'm speaking to. If I'm speaking to my mother, who's known me my entire life, now I just speak in whichever way is easiest, which does tend to be into a lighter tone, with less enunciation, of which she considers to be childish and I consider it to be simpler. She seems quite befuddled when it comes to my speech, because on the one hand she hears how I speak to her, which she assumes is how I speak most of the time out into the world. But then she's also aware of how I've handled myself outside of the home, mostly with school. At school, I was a quiet student. I once again compartmentalized my friendships, being these are the people I speak to when I am in class, and then we will not speak again until the next class unless, say, we're working on some sort of group assignment, of which would require some out-of-class communication. Which leads me to my proof of which I am not a shy person, which is how I handle myself in group situations. Many of you have experienced, well, all of you should have experienced at least once, being forced to work into a group assignment. Now this happened during my third year of university, of which I was taking a course called Research Methods in Business. This course was to teach us how to conduct research for business, which is really a fancy way of saying it taught us how to make customer surveys and how to analyze the results of said surveys. This project was the only project we had for the entire course, and it was a group project. And the prof allowed us to make our groups ourselves. But he also made very clear that you're making these groups on our own discretion. And if you would like to make adjustments to the group or remove somebody from the group, then only he would have the power to do so. And he boldly stated this as we were making our groups. Now, these were fairly large groups. He expected them to be between 5 and 7 students per group, in which case I had 3 friends into that class and we got 2 other guys and formed a group. It became pretty obvious fairly quickly that there was one guy into the group that identified himself to be the leader unilaterally, and he went about collecting everybody's phone numbers and making a group WhatsApp chat for us to communicate, and he started throwing off ideas of what sort of survey we should make and what should it be about. Him, being the typical college student, had us settle upon coffee. What is the role of coffee into the average student's life? How much do they depend on caffeine? And how do they take their coffee? These are the things that he decided that we were going to make a survey about. The project was divided into phases, and phase 1 would be for us to form a 10-question survey, of which would have questions that were properly structured into a way that would make it easy for us to, in some sort of numerical way, and then we would have to be able to then say afterwards what the results mean. Up until that point, the course has been fairly straightforward into what makes a good survey question. When doing a survey, it's not much use to you if you end up making an open-ended question. Nor do you want the survey to be complicated to the point of which somebody has to stop and pause about how do they actually expect you to answer it. Which is why the day before phase 1 was due, of which we would have to submit our surveys so that he can redistribute them in his other sections for them to take, I was sitting in front of my laptop after class and reworking the questions because, despite the discussions I saw going on, this guy decided that his way of forming the questions, which for some reason included a sort of numerical table of which appeared for every question, but not onto some sort of sliding scale, was the correct way to do this, even though the professor has introduced no such way and it was overly complex. So, being the team member I was, I predicted that this would take some sort of negotiation in order to convince him that what he was doing was not what the professor wanted. So I took his questions one at a time and moved them towards the end of the document, and then rephrased all of the questions. I did this, having seen how he reacted to other teammates when they would question his methods or ask for some sort of advice when making their questions. He was dismissive when they asked if their questions were good, and then defensive if they questioned his questions, which is why I just decided to remake all the questions, but not to delete his. In which case I then packed up my stuff and went home, and then afterwards went straight back out to a coffee shop to see my sister. It was late when I got back, about 8 or 9 o'clock, and as soon as I stepped through the door, my phone started to go off, which I noticed I had dozens of messages and missed phone calls on WhatsApp, which I didn't see because I never felt the need to splurge for data. Because being the introvert that I am, I'm not going to be wanting to WhatsApp somebody when I'm not home. Ergo, when I'm not actually face to face with that person, I don't feel the need to speak with them. So why pay an extra $20 a month? Anyway, when I looked at my phone, there were dozens of messages, all of which ranged from, "What the hell did you do?" to, "How dare you change the questions?" to, "I can't believe you did that. You're out of the group." And then seeing that I had been removed from the Google Doc we had been using to complete our assignment. With which then I just started texting him wondering what's wrong. And then his reply is, "How dare I change the questions without telling him first?" Of which I said I fully expected there to be a negotiation, which is why I did not delete your work. I just moved it. And then he said, "It doesn't matter, you're out of the group." And then my reply is, "You can't remove me from the group." The prof said only he would be able to remove somebody. He did not care. He said the group would be submitting the version that he put together, and that I can go and submit my version of the questions all to myself. Of which I'm like, how am I going to do that? You blocked me from the document. So he then sent me a screenshot of the questions I did, and then that was the end of that. The next day, I sent an email submission of my version of the assignment with an explanation as to why we're submitting 2 different versions. The next day, when I was at work, I received an email because I was signed into the workplace's Wi-Fi, and I saw that the prof has sent out a group email saying that there is a mandatory team meeting after the next class. The next class also happened to be our first midterm, so that was just something to have on my mind as I'm trying to study for one of the 3 tests of this course. I then have to think about how this conversation's gonna go afterwards. So that was just on my mind for the next few days until we had our next class. Being at this school for this program, we only had 1 session per week per course. So this takes place over the span of a week. After we wrote the midterm, the prof sat us down into the center of the class, of which he just starts off asking, "So what happened?" Already frustrated, probably because he said very clearly that only he could remove team members, and the fact that we submitted 2 versions was unacceptable. The team member who kicked me out was the first one to answer. Everybody else sort of shrugged and looked away, not actually knowing what happened. But he went on to his rant saying how I changed all of the questions onto the document without saying anything, and how it was really disrespectful and yada yada yada. Which, after a while, the prof stops him, looks at me and says that I've been quiet, of which then he asks for my side, of which I tell him what happened. And afterwards the prof pauses and puts his face in his hand and then looks back up with clearly a frustrated sigh, of which he said, well, nobody's going to be removed from this group, but if I was going to remove somebody, it would have been him. He then went on to say about how the way I formatted the questions was what he wanted, as the other version did not make sense. And during this time, the guy goes silent, just does this really stiff nod, looking directly at the prof, but otherwise just remains silent. Then there was a shift, because after this class, the college side of my school went on strike, since they weren't able to get some sort of agreement on renewing contracts. Fun fact, my school was actually a collaboration between a university called Guelph and a college called Humber. So I went to the University of Guelph Humber, and Humber decided to go on strike, along with the other universities, as a contract has not been renewed. So for a few weeks, we were all just working online. Courses that were run by Guelph professors were just put on pause for the most part, and everything was just individual work. When we came back to class a few weeks later, the guy wasn't there, and I found out the next class that he had dropped the course. Little to say, nobody was shooken up about that fact. I had a laugh about it, and from that point on, I took point into the group. I was the one telling people how we should format things, how we would structure our presentation, because that's how the final product of our assignment is to be formatted. And then the next week, the other guy who was into our group dropped out. So we became an all-girls group and proceeded towards the final project, of which we then did and then nailed. And we were one of two groups who managed to get a perfect score onto that assignment, which was worth 30% of our grade. At the end of that course, when I was walking out of the final exam and handed my exam to the prof, he smiled and told me, "Congratulations, I did excellent during this course." I smiled and thanked him, and I walked out of that course feeling like I had really accomplished something. I was quiet, but I was not shy. I didn't say much. When confronted and then face to face with this guy who thought that he knew everything, I did not instigate an argument with him, especially not in front of the professor. I didn't need to do that. The guy was already digging himself into a deeper hole. He had clearly lost the respect of the professor, and the rest of the group saw how he spoke to me, and then it was no hard feelings when he quietly just removed himself from the class without saying anything. I only saw him once more during my time at that school. We didn't speak, but we were both into one of the study areas of the school, and I saw him across the room. That was the only indication I had that he hadn't fully just dropped out and just packed up. I saw him there and didn't spare him another glance. I knew that I had walked away as the winner in that case, and I also knew that my calm, quiet demeanor is what benefited me in that time, because you don't have to be loud in order to be strong. You don't have to get into somebody else's face in order to make a point. When it comes to some sort of discussion of who's at fault, the one who has a level head is taken more seriously than the one that's yelling, pointing, and trying to bolster everybody's attention. The professor was clearly able to see who was telling the truth and who actually listened to him, so there was nothing else that I needed to do. And especially being a woman, I saw no reason to lower myself to his standards. And I've taken a similar mentality in all of my courses going forward. And it's not surprising that in most group assignments, I ended up being the one taking charge. Partly because I'm not going to let anybody mess with my grade, but I'm also not going to yell at anybody in order to get my way. My quiet demeanor earned the respect of others, and I don't see myself changing any time going forward. Yes, I'm looking for a job. Yes, I would like to eventually get into, say, middle management at a company. But I don't feel like I should have to change how I am in order to get there. And I'll just keep looking until I find a company that sees what my worth is and appreciates it. My mother and I frequently contradict in this sort of matter because she is the type of loud, bold, dominant voice. Although I also would classify as an introvert just due to her lack of desire to socialize and how comfortable she is being on her own. She's more of a social introvert because she's not afraid to speak up her mind as loud as it takes in order to be heard, and she doesn't take any sort of disrespect from anyone, including her superiors. We have two very different methods of communication, both of them effective, but neither of us would be willing to switch to the other's method, nor should we have to. I'm very comfortable being a restrained introvert, and I intend to just keep it that way. Well, thank you so much for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you'll be back to tune into another one of my rants here at A Quiet Voice.